Good afternoon, everybody. Still a few people coming in. Please take your seats. Please come to the front. It will be a little bit cozier. And otherwise we have to shout even into the microphone. Okay, welcome to the session Integrating Bioenergy and Landscape Restoration in the Tropics, the key to a sustainable future. And my name is Christopher Matthews. I'm team leader for climate change in CIFOR, and I'd like to introduce this session, which is part of our work together with our friends and colleagues from Korea, and also other Southeast Asian countries, and actually from Niels from Finland, the funding for part of this work is also coming from Korea. So we are very happy to have this panel here together, talking about bioenergy. We think bioenergy is very important. It's a growing part in our research portfolio. It has been a large part of CIFOR's work over the last 25 years. It has been gone down a little bit. Now we are growing this area again. We see two problems there. First, probably bioenergy cannot cover all the energy needs that the world currently has. So there is a huge scaling problem. And the other one is, in this context, actually the competition with food and food-related agricultural production. So the more land you take for bioenergy, the less you have for food. Although not all food security can be achieved only by growing the area for food production. There are other issues related to it, like post-harvest losses and waste and so on. Still, there is a huge problem. So one of the approaches we are working on is actually trying to grow bioenergy on marginal land, which means land that is not really suitable for food production, too low quality, needs too many fertilizers and so on, or it doesn't have enough water. And then the question becomes, what can you grow in those lands? So that there is a lot of research needed to find the right species for the right places and the right management types and so on. And that's something we are working on. And I'd like to just say that, and that we are working with several partners, particularly in Southeast Asia, from the research section, from governments, and also from the private sector. And we are very happy about this topic, bringing all these different groups together into one consortium, so to say. So with this, I'd like to, I should say something more, one thing more. It is actually a project that is also being funded by our research program on forestries and agroforestry. So with this, I would like to hand over to my colleague Himlal Baral, who's working on this topic in CIFOR, and he will actually moderate the session. And I have to apologize for myself. I cannot stay in this session because I have another appointment. So please forgive me that I'm running out soon after. But I wish you a very nice and very productive session. And we have a smaller audience now, but that means you can have more contributions eventually. So I wish you a very fruitful and interesting session, and I'm happy to have everybody here on the podium. And I just hand over to him now. Thanks, and good luck.
Thank you, Chris, for a nice introduction about the session. I'll give a little bit more background. So, as we all know, bioenergy is the most abundant and versatile form of renewable energy. So, in the world, and it is a key to supporting UN Sustainable Development Goal, and in the context of context of climate change and energy security. So it's an important mix in the energy. So it will provide diversification and also supports in particularly in rural and isolated areas. Bioenergy is great solutions. So while saying that it's not free from from problems, so as Chris already said something like there is a intended and unintended land use changes because of the bioenergy. If it is a more profitable, people may tend to grow bioenergy crops on their food production areas, or it may replace or displace rural communities who are relying on their land resources to produce more bioenergy. So these things need to be carefully managed. And in the other hand, as we know and as we heard in several sessions in the last 2 days, that globally there is a large amount of degraded and underutilized land is available, which can be restored while producing bioenergy. So that's a kind of a win-win solution. Our panelists will bring you several issues and opportunities and challenges, and how can we overcome these issues from science to policy to actually action on ground. So we have a great a team of panelists who are work on research institute, then also policymaker and from the private sector, so who are actually practicing this thing and demonstrating in the field. So this session aims to advance this discussion by bringing this diverse set of experts. So the session will be organized in three parts. The first, we will introduce the science, hardcore science, how we select the species, how do we manage the land for grow right tree in right places, this kind of things, and also bioenergy production is also associated to water issues. So we have a expert hydrologist here who will bring us a science about forest and water. Planting trees makes how we manage balance the water crisis or water issues. Then we will go to more on policy sides, which policymaker from the Indonesian government. We will see how the policymaker sees this development, integrating bioenergy and land restoration in their bigger development agenda. And then we will also talk some experts from the field and implementation on the ground. So before going to the actual presentation, I will introduce our panelist. Our first panelist is Niels Bossard, who is research manager at the plant production at Natural Resources Institute, Finland, commonly known as LUCA. He obtained his PhD degree in geography from University of Bonn, and prior to LUCA, he was also scientist at C4. Our second speaker will be Dr. Hyung Tae Choi. He is a senior researcher and hydrologist at Korea's National Institute of Forest Sciences, who is our partner institution in our C4's bioenergy project. He's major in hydrology, forest hydrology, and he works on forest water laboratory. So our next speaker will be Mrs. Noor Higueti Rahayu. So Dr. Rahayu is a director of forestry and water resources conservation at Ministry of Development Planning in Indonesia, commonly known as Bappenas, where she coordinates and formulates the monitor, evaluate policy, national development plan, and strategy. So very right person to talk about policy issues related to bioenergy and restoration. And she obtained her PhD from University of Queensland in Australia. Our next speaker is Dr. Sumin Lee. He's a senior scientist of National Institute of Forest Sciences in Korea, who leads forest and bioenergy research there. Prior to that, Sumin was also seconded scientist at C4, and he obtained his PhD in wood chemistry from Seoul National University. Last but not least, our another speaker is Mr. Jaya Wahono. Jaya is a founder and CEO of Clean Power Indonesia, and Indonesia's private sector that specializes on development of energy and forest utilization of biomass gasification technology while restoring the land and also empowering local communities so that they can have some livelihood opportunities. So as you can see, we have a quite diverse set of speakers. So I would like to invite our first speaker, Niels Bossard, to enlighten us how to select, how to screen the bioenergy tree species in the tropics. So given the global commitment as we see, so how can we select the right species in right places? So Niels.
Just a second, I guess. We wait for the presentation. Or is it my turn?
Okay, can we go to... Okay.
Okay, great.
Good.
Misunderstandings. As mentioned by Himlal, I worked for 2 years in Indonesia, 2014 and 15. And during that time, I was involved in several projects in forestry, mainly in Kalimantan. So there was an opportunity to have a look on these oil palm plantations. At that time, I was interested to get an idea if there is an opportunity to diversify palm oil plantations by implementing, for instance, legumes that produce oily fruits. So we started at that time to do a review on other crops that we can potentially use for bioenergy purposes, for the production of biomass, bio-oil, or sugar, and in the end also bioethanol. But it was quite hard, because the information on management are rather, it's very hard to find solid and valid information on the number of trees per hectare. What is the best number of trees per hectare? 400, 200,000. Is there a requirement to fertilize? Is there a requirement to drain? All of these information are for numerous species lacking. I will present in the end a table where I can give some examples. And then another problem in Indonesia, not just in Indonesia, is the degradation of peatland due to drainage. So the idea was also to look on potential bioenergy crops that we can cultivate on re-wetted peatland. Just re-wetting preserves the peat to degrade. Even for these species that we can potentially cultivate on re-wetted or even wet peatland, it was more hard to find any information on crops that we can cultivate on these areas, because these species needs to be adapted on this wet environment, and just a few species have been cultivated, but we were able to find some additional information on species that we can potentially cultivate. But let me give some basic information and introduction on soil degradation to get a global overview on the bioenergy issue, and then I will give some examples of our previous work that we could publish this year. It's quite important to say our research addresses zero hunger. For instance, in Indonesia, we can establish or even produce biomass and bio-oil on agroforestry systems, so that it's a mixture of these bioenergy crops and any food crop. Affordable and clean energy for sure, climate action, life on land. But I hide a little bit also the other SDGs, because any activity that we do in accordance to improve or to reduce hunger or to increase the access to affordable and clean energy may have an impact on other SDGs as well, and that we should address in addition. This is a nice figure from a publication published by Gibbs and Salmon in 2015, which gives an information on soil degradation on a global scale. And depending on the group who did this research, it differs a lot. But there are some areas where soil degradation is a severe problem. It's in the tropics, and we can also see in the far north agricultural soils, they are also suffering with degradation, mainly due to loss of carbon. But we need to define what does mean soil degradation in detail, because knowing the degree and the type of soil degradation gives us also information which species or even which rehabilitation and restoration approach we should select and implement to restore degraded land and degraded soils. And that differs strongly. If you would like to restore mineral soils that lost a lot of carbon, the easiest way is to implement vegetation again, a mixture of legumes and other crops. Peat areas needs to be submerged again, so you have to block all of these drains and channels, and that has an impact on the water table in these areas, and the typical now energy crops cannot survive in these areas. So we have to look for species that can survive in re-wetted and wet landscapes. Coming to the bioenergy issue, the majority of biomass is still consumed as a traditional form of fuel. It's burned or even used for cooking. Just a minor amount of the biomass produced is used to generate electricity or even heat by using, let's say, sophisticated or even closed energy systems. So that means we have two things to do. One part is to look on the biomass, bio-oil production in the field, to develop cropping systems and how we can manage. That needs to be clarified, fertilization, etc., etc. And on the other hand, which technology is feasible for specific demands. Let's go back to Indonesia. I worked in Kalimantan, and there we have some settlements somewhere in the nowhere. So it makes sense to install units to convert biomass into energy. Smaller units make sense because these villages are small in comparison to bigger units, because you have to establish a network to bring the electricity produced at these larger units to any end user. But that needs to be clarified. What does make sense? Large units, smaller units, decentralization, what fuel is required? And these are some examples of our research that we could publish this year. One publication, it's a mini review, not more, due to lacking information on managing these crops and lacking information on biomass produced or bio-oil produced or sugar produced, as well as lacking on information on yields and crop management of species that are adapted on wet environments. And we work in close collaboration in Indonesia with colleagues from Indonesia, and one is Professor Budi Leksono. He's an expert for Nyamplung. This is a local name of Pongam. No, Nyamplung. What is the name? Gamal?
Nyamplung is
Nyamplung is Kaliandra.
Calophyllum inoculum.
Yes, and Pongamia?
Pongamia is
Pongamia. Anyway, so we did some research on Pongamia and Calophyllum inoculum, and he is an expert not for the cropping, but for the extraction of oil and the utilization and preparation of these oils, for instance, for the preparation and generation of biodiesel. And this is just an example of the screening. I picked out just some crop species that are adapted to terrestrial environments, so we can use for rehabilitation and restoration of degraded terrestrial land. This is Calophyllum inoculum, Gliricidia sepium, and Pongamia pinnata. That relates also to the publication shown in one slide before. And you can see these crops has been used to produce, for instance, biomass, Gliricidia sepium, for instance, or even oily seeds and fruits that we can use to generate biodiesel. And the main aim of this publication, or even mini-review, was to get an information about the potential generation of energy in gigajoule per hectare and year. And I guess this is important to know, to develop any business model, and to generate and to develop a value chain. In Indonesia, for oil palms, this value chain exists. And it's quite hard for new crops to compete because you have to establish a new value chain and new technologies. And there are some other species that we can potentially use for bioenergy purposes and production of raw material for bioenergy purposes on rewetted land, not just peatland, but also rewetted swampland. But it was quite hard for me to get solid information on number of trees per hectare, potential yields. So this is just an estimation, but that gives a clear indication to us as scientists to look in more depth into the management, how we can manage, how we should fertilize, number of trees per hectare, etc., etc., etc. And this is, I guess, the last slide. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Niels.
Next one.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Niels. And this paper, what Niels is mentioning, and other all work about our bioenergy work is summarized in this publication in the table. So these all are open access. So it links to PDF, and you can also visit in our website. So thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Choi. So he will enlighten us about the expansion of large-scale bioenergy plantations. So it has impact on water. So how can, based on your experience, we would like to hear what are the key factors to be considered where biomass production will not impact to the water, and how this can be balanced at landscape scale. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hyung-tae Choi. I'm with National Institute of Forest Science, South Korea. Now my topic is bioenergy plantation and water conservation. But before talking about that, I would like to something to say first. So a few weeks ago, I had been in Chile to attend the UPRO Forest and Water Conference, and many scientists and the students came from the conference and discussed the various topics related to the forest and water, such as the climate change and ecosystem services and the forest management and so on. Although among them, the most impressive message for me was that from Irina Creed, the professor of the University of Western Ontario in Canada, in her keynote speakings, she said that forest and water are inextricably interconnected, and despite the complexity this creates, they must be managed as a system. In the absence of such management strategies, ongoing changes to forest are altering water supplies. What I would like to say today is similar to her message. Now, many parts of tropics, especially huge area of peatland, are suffering from land degradation. There are many causes for such degradation, but there is no doubt that deforestation is the biggest one. Regions are different, and their climate and environment are also different, but most of the degradation process start from the deforestation. South Korea was the same. So half a century ago, South Korea was one of the most denuded countries in the world. But since the 1970s, active afforestation and restoration have transformed Korea into a representative forest country. Now South Korea is moving from the forest restoration stage to the use and promotion of forest ecosystem services. Forest restoration has made many changes in water. In South Korea, annual precipitation is more than the world average. but 2/3 of the annual precipitation intensively falls in summer season, so it is difficult to balance between the water supply and the demand. In the past, soil erosion was extreme due to deforestation, and floods and drought frequently occurred. Streams always dried except for rainy days, but as the forests were restored, the water cycle has changed a lot. This slide is the result of my institute, NIPOS. The old photo on the top is pictured in 1983, not in 1987. Originally, this watershed was almost devastated. In 1974, we did erosion control works and planted trees. And 40 years passed. Bottom right graph shows the changes of the flow duration curves every 10 years. 30 years ago, the stream flow generated in only 90 days of the year. Only water flowed on rainy days. But now it is flowing all year round, and the normal discharge has also increased. The dried valley has been transformed into a perennial stream due to the forest restoration. As the climate change continues, forest management is becoming more necessary for the sustainable water supply. This should be more emphasized in intensive plantation created for needs of human. We have two important studies on the impact of forest management on water supply, especially in the plantations. In Korea, coniferous plantation has been used to timber production and forest restoration. It is similar to the current situation in Southeast Asia, where we want to achieve both forest restoration and bioenergy production at the same time. This is one of the long-term experimental watershed of NIPOS. We planted conifers in 1976, and after 20 years, we had thinned the forest, and another 20 years have passed. The bottom right graph shows the change of the annual average runoff rate over 40 years. During the first 20 years, as the trees grow, the water supply has decreased. The cause was decrease of water loss. The cause was increase of water loss due to too dense trees, where we when we thinned the forest, water supply has increased to 1.5 times. This effect lasted about 10 years, and then it returns back to the before thinning level because the trees have grown and the water losses increased again. So we have thinned again the forest last year with various intensities after thinning on the story vegetation, and biodiversity increased and the water supply increased, and the water quality was affected by thinned work, but gradually improved. In addition, long-term forest water quality investigations shows the forest management of plantations could be improved water quality, especially by the reduction of nitrate concentration. However, it is also clear that presentation with only one purpose can lead to many unexpected problems in water conservation. case study of the poor land presentation that has caused water problems can be easily found around the world. Bioenergy plantations in the tropics will definitely contribute to forest restoration and energy problem solving, but it should be planted carefully. Effective management of bioenergy plantation for water should improve the bioenergy plantation management via strategies that meet both productivity and water conservation goals, and consider the maintenance and the provision of environmental services across the landscape, specifically water conservation, and establish the watershed as planning unit of management strategies for incorporating water conservation into the plantation plan. But science does not support simple one-size-fits-all universal solutions for managing forests for water. So there are many knowledge. Managing forest for water requires the right kind of forest or trees at the right place and at the right time with the right practices. And there are many knowledge gaps needed to fill for water conservation and sustainable bioenergy plantation in tropics. So we need a lot of new information and studies. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi, for explaining this very important issue about forest and water, and also a strategy for managing bioenergy plantation for water. Our next speaker is Ibu Yuka, who will enlighten us about the role of government policies in synergizing bioenergy and landscape restoration, especially lessons from Indonesia. And how do you see the role of private sector, research institution, and other parties to managing this issue? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm talking about the forest-based bioenergy because it's my work. This is the figures of our policy in energy. So in the top one, this is the condition of the current until the 2015. We still rely on the three main sources of fossil fuel energy with oil, gas, and coal, but only about 6%, and maybe right now about 8% of the new and renewable energy resources. And we already have the policy for energy mix policy 2025. We will have to increase the ratio or the percentage of new and renewable energy and the 23%. And this is the list of the NRE, and one of them is bioenergy. So if we again look at the proportion of the bioenergy in 2015, it's about 1.2% for the overall. And for the 2025, the target is about 8.4%. And then when we talk about the bioenergy, it's coming from the source, any source from the bio, like from the forest, agriculture, livestock, and also from the waste. And one of them, because it's a forestry in my sector, so from that, before it's from the side of the energy and now the side from the forest. So to respond to that policy, we have the Indonesian land is about 187 million hectares. And if we look at that, about 24 million is in the critical land or degraded land. Aside from that, we already also assigned that about 124 million hectares as the state forest area. And we use that state forest area for the conservation. It's about 20 27 million hectares, and then for the protected areas, and also from for the production forest. Still, more than half is for the production forest. We assign for the concession holders to have in the production forest, mostly for the big companies, but we now also use as also for the social forestry. And in our midterm development plan 2015 until 2019, we already allocated about 100,000 hectares. So it's very, very small as a beginning for bioenergy from forest base. And the achievement until the end of 2017, actually about 70% already allocated. So the concession holders with the plantation forest already allocated the areas for the energy forest. And the example is in the smaller, in the village level, there's a forest management unit. They manage about 139,000 hectares, and then they allocated very small, 150 hectares for the energy plantation. Later, that they will build the power plant, so they will produce about 200 kilowatts. They can replace the right now diesel fuel to electricity for 350 households. And why is we use the forest-based bioenergy? Because we have at least two kinds of the energy coming from this forest sectors. One is from the solid. We have the biomass. We have the short rotation copies or the fast growings. We can use as energy like from pellet, briquettes. But then also we have the liquid, the oil seeds production plants, like the one that Neil said, Nyamplung, Pongam, and others. We have lots of kind of plants like that, so we can plant in the degraded lands. We can harvest the seeds and producing oils without cutting the trees. And we have different types of that trees around Indonesia. But again, we face some challenges. Even the one that we allocated from the 100,000 hectares, not all already operated in the field. So they already planted, but we face that until now there's a limited evidence that using the bioenergy from forest sectors is very limited, except that like in the sawmill, the plants, they use like the waste from the trees, put in as a burner in their plants, but outside of that, that's not yet. So when we have the feedstock suppliers that the forest from the from the sides, and then they have to sell as a feedstock to the IPP or to the power plants, and then the price maybe is quite challenging, whether the price now when they plant it or later when they harvest. And then with the IPP, that they have the agreement with the PLN, our state-owned companies, to provide the electricity in the whole Indonesia, and from that they give to the users, or directly from the IPP based on the agreement to use to the end users. But again, because we still have some numbers in the equation, so sometimes when we compare the bioenergy to the fossil fuel, they say that it's more economical with the fossil fuels right now. So it's quite difficult for them, for the players in the feedstock suppliers to start planting and also harvesting. And also the continuity of the feedstock is questioned by the IPP. Some of them, like the local owned companies, the local government owned companies, try to be as the power plant operators or the IPP, but still in now early stage on that thing. But we already start with that. I think that's so. For again, with the policies already in place, but to action still need another a step for that. So Indonesia will do again to support the forest-based bioenergy. I think, yeah. So the government also needs to support the for more research and development, and for also the private sectors, we need to more also investors for the long-term bioenergy. We can have very short, and how we also involve the society to understand that why we need the bioenergy for the future of energy in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Sumin Lee, who will provide us some major critical factors required for successful small or medium scale bioenergy projects and challenges and how to overcome those challenges. Big question.
Okay, thank you, Imran. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sumin Lee from the Korea, the National Institute of Forest Science. Today, I'm leading the biofuel lab in my company, but today my topics are a little bit more generic. So I would like to ask you, all of you, about some policy and some general questions. Okay, I start. I also bring some old photo from the Korea. This photo is taken in maybe 1950s. So that time in Korea mountains, a little bit no trees. So nearly 50% of mountains were treeless. So 64% of land is located to the mountain. So 50% is treeless. That means 1/3 of the land there is no tree. And then bottom line, we have some photos, another photos. You can see that the left one, that's kind of fuel wood is things. So after Korean War, so people in Korea still use fuel wood as their household energy source. So many people just went to the forest and then cut the tree and then make a fuel wood and they sell the market and then make some money for their family. The problem is what? It's a different situation with Indonesia because in winter time, the temperature is going down to less than 10 Celsius degree. So without fuel, without energy, we cannot survive. So these things is a kind of desperate things. And the government tried to stop that illegal logging in a forest to provide a lot of acts and regulations, even though the illegal logging is in a forest. One day, and in the middle of 1970s, government started some different policy. We called it a New Village Movement. The New Village Movement is a little bit different with the regulation because the government invests some budget to the construct the infrastructure for the village. So that including the new road for the farming and then the improvement in a toilet. Sometimes it's digging a well for the village. And then another one is new stove installation for each household. And the second thing is government is try to change the primary energy source from wood to coal. It's a new village movement. So this sounds like to me, it's a very irony, because these days we just are talking about the climate change and the carbon dioxide emission reduction. And then at that time is coal, it's a fossil fuel, and contribute to the deforestation. Reduction of deforestation. So it's a little bit irony. Even though, so right now in 2017, so gross stock per hectare over Korean mountains is more than 150 cubic meter. That's more than average of the OECD countries. So right now is quite high. Second one is I learned about some burn challenge. This is very clear. I got this one is from the website. It's 150 million hectares of the world's deforested and degraded land into restoration by 2020, and 350 million hectares by 2030. And then to do that, there is a new concept, I think, as a forest landscape restoration is introduced in our field. Then the meaning is what? Is the planting tree just more than the planting tree. So it's restoring a whole landscape is to meet present and future needs to and offer multiple is a benefit. So it sounds like very sustainable concept to me, and I like it. So and then now I'm going to my topic. I got the homework from the Himlar. He asked me about this one. Scaling up the bioenergy technology friendly, small, medium industrial scale. This is quite difficult to me, and I already showed some photos. So it's not easy to make a very simple decision. First thing, my topic is why we talking about biomass in the world. Still, so many people talking about biomass and they convert it to the biofuel and they produce a bioenergy. For me, biomass is more important resource, sustainable resource, because just the biomass can serve that our whole replacement of fossil fuel. Up to now, we just are talking about the fuel, energy, heat or electricity. But when we think about other renewable energy sources like hydro, wind, and photovoltaic, geothermal, that kind of energy source is right. That's a renewable energy source, and that source produce heat and electricity. But normally, so right now we use a lot of plastics and a lot of textiles. So most of them are from the fossil oil. So without biomass, if the biomass is the only answer to solve that kind of problem. What I mean is even we can use electricity as a renewable one, even though still we need to use fossil oil to produce the plastic. So that's why biomass is quite an important role in future world. That's what I think. And second one is when we go to the field to produce biomass and convert the biomass to the bioenergy, I think we need to consider a lot of things. We have a lot of types of biomass in the world, and then there is no one answer, because different situation and different types of biomass, we need a different kind of pathway. So I think we need to consider several
key words is environment is the first. That means we need to know how much biomass we have in our village or in our sector, and then what kind of biomass we have, and then how often we can harvest that. So, that's a period, because if we can just harvest, one time in a year, we cannot build a factory, because that's the only energy source. So different type of biomass, and then different period. So we have to mix them together. After that, we can think about what's the answer for the biomass and bioenergy. Second one is technology. Biomass conversion technology is very various. So biodiversity, like here is biomass and technology diversity is there. So already so many parts of the technology is modularized. So if we think about some clear target for the bioenergy, in that case we can find what is the most efficient way to produce that kind of fuel. So that's just one part of our field. It's not everything. And second one, the human resource. That's what I want to say. This is about capacity building of a local community, something like that. So human resource is a very, very, very important. There are so many policy and governance, even though we have a lot of resource there, but people don't want to move to that direction, we cannot get success in the field. That's what I think. And the governance and the policy, that will also very important. So what I want to talk to you today is most thing is, if we want to get some achievement from the Born Challenge target, so in that case, we need to set up the very clear target and then very clear specific bioenergy source or biofuel, and we need to support from the local community. So without that, and we cannot get success in field. That's what I think. Here is one example. Dr. Niels Burchard already mentioned about some species. These days we really interested in the yamplung. This oilseed plant, and survived well in peatland. And we just first report to the government at this time, because nobody didn't try it. Yamplung can be survived in the peatland. And then yamplung is very, very interesting. The flower provides some honey, and the seed, we can extract a lot of vegetable oils, and it can survive in the peatland, and even the woody biomass is also can be converted to the other resources. So very multiple values is there. So if right now we have 5 sites in Indonesia, and then try to prove this yamplung is quite a promising tree species in peatland. We planting more than 15 hectares in Indonesia right now. So maybe 2 or 3 years later, we can find something from this species. And even though we have this species, but if we don't have some support from the field or local community, I think we cannot get a success at our bioenergy program at local community level. That's what I think, and that's what I want to share with you. Last slide is this is a little bit reference. When we talk about some technologies in a solid biofuel, there are some very great things. Yep. Torrefaction is a pyrolysis, gasification can be chosen one of the process, and after that, depending on the products, we can design more details for the full process for the biofuel and bioenergy. But when to design this one is that we need to think about the supply chain, and then we need to think about the value chain of our fuels. Without market, we don't need to produce our biofuel. So we have to consider, we need to get concrete is a customer. Without that, if we just produce a biofuel, and then even the process is not fully efficient, in that case, that business is not easy to get success. Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumin, for providing us very important issues related to technology and key important factors. Our final speaker is, we talk about science and policy, but now this theme of this Global Landscape Forum is commitment to action. So we have someone who already showed these things in field. So Clean Power Indonesia has demonstrated successful example of land restoration and rural electrification in one of the islands in Indonesia. So we would like to hear from Jaya, how do you see this? This is actually you got from the grant from Millennium Challenge account, but is that commercially viable business to Indonesia or elsewhere, and what's next? Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Himlal. Before I answer that question, I would like to stress more about I will be the kind of people that have to put all the findings that all these gentlemen have and the policy that is made by the policymaker, just like the Biomass in Indonesia, on the ground. So I will have the responsibility to face the people on the ground and how to explain to them what is needed to be done and what kind of a policy that need to be revised. So maybe I'm the person who has to give back the findings on the ground, maybe something wrong or what needs to be corrected. But the motivation that made me going into this sector is this one. This is the map of Indonesia. Do we have the map? Yeah. At night. So imagine if you don't have electricity for a couple of hours in the city. Many people in Indonesia living in the rural communities don't have electricity for the rest of their life. And even if they have access to electricity, it's only a couple of hours a day, and it's sometimes it's not reliable. Why it's happening? Because energy is so expensive. That's the roots of the problem. The energy that they have to access to, it's very expensive, and it's not enough to improve their livelihood. So Indonesia is the biggest archipelago country in the world. It's very difficult to bring energy source just like crude oil or diesel fuel when it's refined, or coal or natural gas to all these remote islands. So we have to find another way to bring reliable, equitable, and affordable electricity to all this local population. And if you think about electricity, this is the main requirement for everything that you need in your life, for healthcare, for education, for telecommunication, for fishery product processing, for any industry to come in. Without electricity, it's not going to flourish. And Indonesia have about 250 million people. So around 40% living in the rural areas. So if we are going to provide them with the modernization, modern life, you have to think about how they can access electricity. So this is what we developed in Indonesia in my pilot project. We call it listrik gotong royong. It's in our word. It means that we help each other to bring electricity. So this is not just one person or one company that can deliver this, but the whole village need to help and participate. So all the people living in the village will have allocation of land to grow bamboo. In this regards, we use the biomass from bamboo. Why bamboo? Because bamboo is native species in any small island all over Indonesia. We don't need to import it. So it's there already. So we use what is already there. And we multiply and make modern use of bamboo. So the bamboo is being sold to our power plant, and they get the money. The local population get the money out of this transaction. We convert that biomass, in this regard is bamboo, into electricity and sell it to the utility company. That is a state-owned utility company. We call it a PLN. And PLN is the only utility company that operate in Indonesia. So anywhere you go to Indonesia, you will have to buy electricity from PLN. So then PLN distribute back the electricity to the community with subsidized tariff. So imagine if you don't have PLN and you don't have the private sector to generate this electricity. What the community end up doing is to have their own diesel gensets. And it's cost them around 50 cents or even up to $1 per kilowatt hour. Who can pay for $1 per kilowatt hour? So nobody. And once we have the PLN and this scheme, then they will only pay 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So how it's going to impact in their life? If before this project, you pay $1 per kilowatt hour, and the next day you only pay 3 cents per kilowatt hour. 97% reduction. Imagine the life that is going to be changed, the education, the healthcare, the industry that can come into this area. So this is the model that we want to replicate all over Indonesia, because not only that the local population has to provide us with the bamboo, but the local population has to grow it. They have to understand about the where to grow, how to do intercropping, because we don't want them just to grow bamboo. We want them to grow food crop as well. We want them to grow other commodity crop, because Indonesia is one of the richest biodiversity in the planet. Everything that we have there, it's probably not found anywhere in the world. Not only the flora, but also the fauna. Not only on land, but also on the coastline, coastal area. So we have to take care of that rich natural resources and use it for our livelihood improvement. We cannot ignore the people living in the forest. We cannot ignore people living in the near the very sensitive habitat, just like the coral reef and all the mangrove area. Because if you don't bring livelihood to them, then they will deforest the whole thing. They will destroy the whole thing, because that's the only way they can live. So this is the way that we try to bring the modern lifestyle, but without the negative aspect of it. So the model provide them with the means to restore the land, the means to produce electricity locally, and cooking fuel. This is another important thing. They need to eat. So how are they going to get the cooking fuel before? It's LPG. It's a liquid petroleum gas. It has to be transported from from the capital city to the provincial city, and then to the regency level, and then to the very remote area. It's very expensive, not very cost effective, because then the tank has to be returned all the way back to the capital city and back. And that's stupid. I mean, we have the biomass resources there. So we can just change the cook stove and replace all this LPG, which is imported. In Indonesia, 70% of LPG is coming from overseas. The diesel fuel is coming from overseas, 50% of that. And we can also use the heat coming from the engine to dry the agriculture crop. So it helps them to be more self-sufficient. So this is why the reason why we choose bamboo, because bamboo is a restoration plant. We see with our own eyes that it grows very well in Indonesia. The first 3-4 years is only, it's not shooting out from the ground, but after it matures, when we cut down, then it just grows back. It's very short time. So it's a fast-growing species that will help to restore the land and also provide us with the biomass that we need to improve our livelihood. So I will end the presentation with this picture. This is in the middle of the jungle. This is not just a dream anymore. This is a reality. We built this in Indonesia already. And this helped the local population to improve their livelihood, to understand more about the landscape that they have surrounding their home, and also to give example to other communities, to other villages, to other islands, that is possible to create local energy source, restore the landscape, and improve their livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jaya, showing us excellent example from the field. So yeah, now we have seen some science behind restoring, finding right tree in right places, and also water issues and policy, and some action on ground. So now please feel free to ask your question to one of the panels. Please kindly introduce yourself, who you are, and your question, who you want your question to be addressed. Thank you. There is some attendance form. Please kindly fill that. So that's for our record, and we will share you some of the findings and outcomes of this workshop discussion forum. Yeah, that's back there.
Hi, thanks. Lara Miles from UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre. I wanted to ask about the business case for these alternative bioenergies. So it was really nice to see a table with energy production potential for these different legumes, for example. How does these things compare to oil palm? I know oil palm has all sorts of problems. I'm just wondering about the attractiveness of these different models.
Do you want to address?
Or I can say something. As far as I know, there doesn't exist any business model for the most of these crops. For instance, Kaliandra, yes, and for Pongamia, there is something ongoing, but it's quite difficult to compete to the palm oil business model. Everything is in place, and for the other crops, these things has to be established. And the second part of the table shown relates to plants that we can cultivate on wetlands, rewetted peatlands. There doesn't exist. So that's really new, and we have to invest in research and development. For instance, harvesting any biomass or even food on wetlands, it's a challenge, and we need to invest into the technology, development of technology that we can use in these areas. But maybe they can add something.
Yeah, we are actually working towards, like, some of the things That's not there. For example, when we grow Namplung or Pongamia for 1 hectare, how much you can harvest, how much you can make on different scenario, like a conservative scenario, optimistic scenario. That kind of information we are actually putting together. We are working, and for Namplung we have some information. This is now we have submitted to the journal, so it will be available through our website C4. But other species, we are currently working on different species. So that's kind of yeah.
One more query. So in terms of the annual potential energy, sorry, in terms of the annual potential yield of the energy from these plants that you could be growing on wetlands instead, is the potential there to compete with oil palm?
Yes, it is.
That's
But
so good to hear.
yeah, yes, it is. But we need to put some efforts into research to get an idea how we can cultivate and into the harvest technologies. There exists also a very specific term describing any cropping system on peatlands. It's called paludiculture, and there is something ongoing, and this research relates also to that topic of research. There is a quite good professor at the University of Greifswald, it's Han Joosten, and he is doing some research on that topic. But we are the first group who looked on woody species and tried to get an information on potential energy yields in gigajoule per hectare and year. That's the first time. And that may help to develop business models. But we need to invest in testing my estimations and to validate them.
Okay. Now Jaya can add
Yeah.
something about.
Yeah, I just want to add some more knowledge. Contrary to common belief, palm oil in Indonesia only exists in 2 islands, which is Sumatra and Kalimantan. They don't exist in Java, very small in Sulawesi now. Papua, not yet, hopefully not. And the government already put a moratorium for expansion of palm oil plantation. I already expect that wherever we go, I mean, especially in Europe, we will be asked about the palm oil. I mean, it's a very controversial issue, but I think what I would like to give more contribution to the discussion is we have so many things, or so many alternatives than palm oil in Indonesia. Yes, we do need some more scientific data. We need also a business model that will work, so private sector can also grow this sector, not only Nyamplung, but also the biomass production for electricity. Because crude oil, the diesel fuel in Indonesia is not only for transportation, but there's a big portion is for generating electricity. And now the government also want to replace that diesel fuel with the palm oil fuel, the biofuel coming from CPO, the crude palm oil. But again, it still needs logistics. It still needs transportation, storage, and everything. Whereas the local biomass doesn't need the transportation, doesn't need storage. It will be more cost competitive, and it will give money back to the community that using that energy. So I think we have to think beyond palm oil. I agree. There are so many alternatives, especially for power generation. We can have a biomass, biogas. There's so many ways to generate electricity from biogas and biomass. In my case, is using the biomass gasification, but there are so many other ways to do it. So, yeah, so I guess this is a good exercise that we need to go beyond palm oil. There are so many alternatives, and we have 17,000 islands. Only 2 islands, and everybody talking about that 2 islands. We have the 16,000 and so island that we can exploit for other types of energy.
Okay, one question there, and Lou, and the next one.
Hello, my name is James. with a 510 mix. I have a question for the gentleman regarding the bamboo to electricity proposition. So you had mentioned the rate of 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Is that heavily subsidized? Because that's the rate that the customer is going to be paying. What is more like the rate that it's going to cost? So the other question is the size of these power plants in megawatts. How often are they distributed in each one? Is it a 5 megawatt, a 20 megawatt, 100 megawatt?
Okay.
And the last question, sorry, is why was there not any involvement of photovoltaics in the mix? Photovoltaics have become very affordable, and they have a lower carbon footprint, and they can last for 30, 40 years with very little maintenance, and there's, again, no transport whatsoever, not even little trucks to go from the bamboo field to the power plant. It's all power lines. Thank you.
Right away? Yeah, okay. Thank you, James. So the first question, I already touched that issues in my presentation, that we only have one company in Indonesia to distribute electricity to the customer. So the price is the same anywhere. Either you live in Jakarta, which is the capital city, or in the middle of the jungle, PLN sell the electricity with the same price. And with the for the lowest income bracket, they have subsidized tariff. So 3 cents is not the rate for people in Mentawai only, but the same rate for the people living in Java or in Papua or in other cities in Indonesia. Of course, the cost of generating that electricity in Jakarta and in Papua and in Mentawai is different. But the government covered that with a subsidy. And the subsidy is now ranging around 4 to 5 billion US dollar per year. And mostly goes to fossil fuel. That's the sad part. I mean, if we find a way to bring electricity with lower costs and shifting away from fossil fuel and giving back the money into the local community, that must be much favorable. But we don't need to worry about the 3 cents per kilowatt hour, because that's already the set of price that the government already give to all the population of Indonesia. What we need to worry about, how much is the PLN spending and what they're spending on. If they're spending on imported diesel fuel, that doesn't give a benefit to the country in general. So we have to think about creating local energy source, not relying on imports anymore, and giving the money back to the community whenever the energy is produced and consumed. Second question is about the capacity. The capacity that we built in Mentawai is 150 kilowatt modules. Every village will only need 150 kilowatt up to 300 kilowatts. So we developed 3 system, power plant and grid system for every village. We electrified 3 villages, overall 1,200 households, and around 300 to 400 business and social use. This 100 kilowatt and 50 kilowatt system is perfect for us, especially for village. And once they have the more demand, then we can put more. I think this is the standard capacity that is needed in Indonesia, but we can build a 1 megawatt system, or between 100 to 1 megawatt system. That's all possible. But villages will only need around 300, maybe maximum 500 kilowatt system. So we have to be flexible. It has to be modular, because like the power plant that I showed you in the presentation, that need to be transported with helicopters. because it's in the middle of the jungle. So of course, it costs a lot, but this is it's funded by grant. The purpose is to prove the concept that the local population accept this model. Government see this as an opportunity to scale up all over the country. Once this is proven, then we want to make sure that the policy and the funding is in place to make sure that the government then can cut the subsidy, the local population get the reliable electricity, and the private company like ours can have a good return. The last question is about solar PV. I have nothing against solar PV, but in Indonesia, yes, the irradiation is high, but you got clouds in Indonesia, and based on our experience, it happens that is the capacity factor is less than 15%. Okay, and in the remote area, then you have to supply with the battery because most of the load is during the nighttime, not during the daytime. So if you provide them with the battery, I think it costs still around 40 cents per kilowatt hour. Well, if you can do better, then come to me and we'll discuss it. Yeah, but for biomass distributed power is only about 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's what you're again saying. Thank you.
Lou, yeah.
Yeah, Lou Versh for the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. I just want to come back to this peatland issue. I'm a little concerned because we're not looking for something to compete with oil palm, because that means we're going to continue to drain and exploit these peats, and that's where we're going to get the emissions. Right? Solving the problem is about finding alternative ways of producing what Indonesia wants to produce outside of peatlands. And Nils, you may be optimistic about polluticulture. I'm not as optimistic. Even draining for sago results in emissions and results in subsidence that will eventually lead to the collapse of the peat domes. So it's sustainable for longer times than oil palm, but it's still going to be drained, and it's still going to require. It's still going to result in subsidence. So I'm not convinced that that's what's going to happen. And we may want to rely on the moratorium, but the moratorium is by the Forest Ministry. And the Agriculture Ministry has very optimistic projections for development of oil palm production in Indonesia. And unless you start solving the land allocation issues, I mean, remember the reason that the oil palm companies went into these peatlands was because nobody was there. There was no competition for land. There was no land title was clear and easy to get hold of, and that's what's holding them back from moving on to mineral soils. Production on mineral soils is much, much cheaper than it is on organic soils. Once you have to drain, once you have to pump, production gets very expensive, and so you have to have these high-value types of crops like oil palm that can sustain the returns on investment that allow you to pay for this pumping. So I wouldn't be so optimistic about finding solutions with other production systems on peat systems or on peatlands. I think the solution is finding ways to solve some of the other structural problems within the country so that production can be moved off of peatlands and into areas where it's more sustainable.
Thank you, Lou. You want to add? Yeah.
So the idea was not just to look for sago or nipa palm. We also looked for species that can survive on continuously wet peatland. And the idea is not to convert pristine swamp forest into another land use system. The question was in 2014 and 15 to restore degraded peatland, which is already degraded, for instance in South Kalimantan. And what I had realized, I had just a look into these projects, they still drain. And we have the problem that the peat degrades. And I think to preserve the peat body, it has to be submerged, or even the water table should be close to the water surface. And the traditional energy crops cultivated in Indonesia, even yamplung, so Calliandra inophyllum, or the other crops, they cannot survive on continuously wet soils. So the idea was to look also on other crops that the farmers in these regions can potentially use as an energy crop. So the idea, to make it short, is not to convert pristine peat swamps into any bioenergy plantation. It's just to give other tools to initiatives who are interested to restore degraded peatlands.
Yeah.
But in fact, you are completely right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If you want to add something here.
Yeah, I would like to add about the peatland. Yeah, we would like to restore, so keep the or improve the quality of the peatland already degraded. So we use and then restore, and now we have the agency really have the function for restoring the peatland. And again, with the bioenergy in the forest, we would like to use at the mineral soil and not to compete with the peatland. And again, with the oil palm, yes, we already know that they use the peatland because there's less conflict with the people, but then now we would like to again restore the peatland, but also how to use the degraded land, the mineral soil, to plants the bioenergy, not to compete again with the food. If the forest in the forest area, we still have the quite a large area, so not competing with the food and also with the other forest products. So.
Thank you very much. So yeah, if there is any other questions, we need to continue discussion after this session because of the time. We need to close it now. So our panelists will be here for another hour or so, yeah, and we are happy to discuss more. And thank you very much to our all panelists for bringing this interesting insights, and thank you for you all staying for 1.5 hours to listen our talk. Thank you very much.